Just a couple of the tips when writing questions. Measure one construct at a time, right? So avoid double-barreled questions. Make sure that your question has the same meaning to all respondents. And so that means you can use as many words as necessary to ensure that everyone's focused on the same question, the same construct of interest. And so there's this notion, this common notion in survey research where these questions have to be short. Well, that's not true. The questions have to be long enough so that everyone's thinking about the same thing. So you could say, some people eat out at restaurants all the time. Other people never eat out at restaurants. The president eats out at restaurants once a month. However many words that you feel are necessary to focus people's attention, use that many words. Avoid emotionally charged words. So earlier we were talking about abortion or the death penalty. Maybe you might want to say capital punishment or pro-choice or pro-life if you have a feeling that the words inside the question are actually going to create emotion that'll push responses around. Avoid leading questions. How good was the healthcare? Well, maybe you had bad healthcare. How clean was the restaurant? Well, maybe it was dirty, right? So how clean or dirty, bipolar, was the restaurant? And be specific. So at SurveyMonkey, we have two products. We have the online product and the phone product, which means we have two modes. Some questionnaires that are presented visually and questionnaires that are presented orally. And there are some biasing effects that can occur inside those two modes. So for visual questionnaires, the items presented first get selected slightly more often than the items presented later. So what happens is when people are being a bit lazy, they read until they find an answer that's acceptable or justifiable to the researcher, stop, select that answer, and move on. Whereas when you're listening to response options presented orally, you sort of have a better chance of remembering the last couple than the first few, and so it pushes response options toward the recent ones. And so in questionnaires presented visually, you have a primacy effect, and questionnaires presented orally, you have a recency effect. And so that's where you want to randomize, rotate, or flip your response options to sort of eliminate these two effects. Always questions around including a don't know option or a not applicable. And the answer is, it depends. If it's a question like, what's the GDP of China? And you don't have a reasonable expectation that your respondents might know this, then you might include a don't know, because that's a real attitude. I don't know. And so maybe you're trying to get a sense of how many people actually know the GDP of China. And so don't know response option is a reasonable one. Whereas if you've got a question like, how many kids do you have? You have a reasonable expectation that people know that, and so you don't want to give them the bailout answer to speed through your questionnaire by simply offering don't know response options. And so, it depends on whether or not you think people know something. If your questionnaire is getting really long and people are trying to get through it, they might gravitate towards a don't know. So you want to be judicious in your use, but you don't want to measure just non-attitudes. So if it's, what's the GDP of China, and you give some closed-ended response options, then you're going to inevitably measure people's attitudes, or non-attitudes, because they don't know, but you force them into giving an answer. And so that will cloud the findings for your research study. What about why questions? Why do you like working at your corporation? Because it's cool. Why questions tend to lend themselves to sort of one-word, unusable answers like that, and then your instinct is to say, well, what's cool about it? So essentially, why questions are a bunch of what questions. So it's easier to just ask more what questions or rating scales than a why question. And so what is cool about your corporation? Or, what are some of the benefits, right? The coffee maker, the parking, something, right? And so you essentially roll what questions into why questions. So it's better to ask what's and rating scales than whys. So there are several questions these days about making surveys more engaging, more sexy, more attractive, because people don't have much time, And so we've got to make this questionnaire interesting so that they'll stick around and give us good answers. Well, one of the strategies that people like to employ these days is moving away from these radio buttons and moving on to a flash slider. So some basically little bar that you move along a continuum to express your response. And so far, it looks like two things happen. Oftentimes, the slider is set to a particular position when the person arrives at the question, and so you're essentially, it'd be like giving them radio buttons where one of them's already filled out. And so if you want to speed through, if you had a questionnaire that had all the radio buttons in a certain position, you could just sort of click done and there would be real answers there. And so depending on where you start the slider, that can have effects. Or some people who maybe aren't used to the technology become enamored with moving the slider around and watching the score move around or what have you. And so they are now distracted by the instrument and not really taking care to and thought in offering their answers. And so at the end of the day, making a questionnaire more engaging isn't going to help. If you haven't tired your respondents by asking questions that are difficult to respond to, like mapping the quality of healthcare onto agree, disagree, and so forth, and then getting that to extremely good healthcare, you don't do those sorts of things, and you don't need to make your questionnaire sexy. It's just a simple process that people can get through. One of the other questions we hear a lot has to do with how many questions should I put on a screen? Like, should I have my entire survey with scrolling, or should I break them up into parts? And there's been some research done on whether or not scrolling makes a difference in the response options offered. And so far, there isn't much evidence showing that that does have an effect. So people are sort of free to do it however feels comfortable for them. But I would suggest one sort of qualitative caveat, which is when you see a page that's crowded with lots of things, even if they're individual questions with individual rating scores, you get the sense that the researcher's saying, fill this out and get through this thing because I've got to show it to someone. I've got to get some data. Whereas when you give people that one question, you're asking them to slow down, take some time, think about what I'm asking, and give me your best answer. And so I would say, when in doubt, or if it isn't going to make much difference in terms of space, then go ahead and ask one question per screen. Because after all, the visual presentation of questionnaires really delineates from face-to-face conversations or face-to-face interviews or telephone interviewing. And so if you've got a situation where you're going to use a telephone interview on the one hand and paper and pencil or SurveyMonkey on the other, then you want to replicate that experience as best as possible. And it's impossible for me to ask you 10 questions at once orally, but I can do that if I show them all to you on one piece of paper or one screen. And so if you want to faithfully represent what happened in an orally administered survey, you'd want to do one question per screen.